Welcome to CX to the N Factor, brought to you by CX Studios. This podcast is all about customer experience, aka CX, and the tools and strategies that businesses can implement to be successful with their marketing technology investments. Hosted by Liana Li Evans, VP of Learning and Delivery Enablement, each episode is packed with insight into creating successful customer experiences. For more, go to cxstudios.io. And now, let's dive into the CX to the N Factor.
Welcome back to the CX to the N Factor podcast from CX Studios. I'm Li Evans, and I'm here with Jenni Bruckman from Wevo. She is the VP of Customer Success and Strategic Partnerships. And we're here to talk today about how UX testing affects the customer experience across the board. And it's pretty much from end to end. You want to test all your different engagement points. And we're looking at it from a perspective of from customer experience with CX Studios. We're looking at it how it touches from the time that you're doing awareness to actually using it in acquisition, customer funnels, and customer conversion funnels, as well as into customer loyalty. So I wanted to kind of get your opinion from working with Wevo, Jenni. How has the traditional UX testing and research methods, how are they failing customers at this point who are trying to adapt to this new world?
Yeah, so I think what we see is the more data we have available, the harder it is to make sense of what that data tells us and then what to do with that data. And we've spent so much time and effort really focused on industry, experts are digging at what the quant tells us primarily. And so you've got all these various data sources and you've got data visualization techniques and all this fun stuff to help you make sense of that quant data, but it doesn't do anything to fill in the gap on why. And so I think where most UX experiences get hung up is they're traditionally caught in this counterbalance of, I don't understand why our data is performing the way it is, or pointing to the breakpoints in our funnel that it is, or the lack of engagement that we're seeing, or whatever it may be. And then to answer that why, some of the traditional methods to uncover that are typically just very labor intensive and very hard to do. And so we've seen a massive uptick in that demand for insights really, really creeping onto the scene even stronger than we've seen before.
So do you think it's a lot of analysis paralysis, like too much data just is, there's so much out there. It's hard to really figure out what works and what's not working.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is that there was such a heavy focus. I come from the space of A/B testing and optimization, and that is really about a 10, 15-year-old specialty within digital organizations. And so what we would see is that it's a very long tail curve for people to understand, experimentation is a key driver in understanding what's going to work and what doesn't before we just make assumptions and release experiences that don't align to customer expectations. But then we also have this piece of once that gets off the ground, now we have really sophisticated organizations doing that either in-house or with partner teams that help them excel faster. But then they still struggle to make the impact and the momentum and the roadmap that they intended early on because they don't have that why piece. And they typically are now plugging that in. And I think we're seeing a similar trend to what we saw in A/B testing and optimization 10 years ago. I think we're seeing that in UX research and really customer insights as a whole. And that is made up of qualitative and quantitative data sets. And so I think, it's a analysis paralysis to some extent if we have more data than ever before, but it's also just that it's hard and messy and complicated data and oftentimes exists in different silos and different parts of an organization that are owned by different teams, and how teams structure that and access it between each other. And then the tool sets that they have to access and understand those insights is just widely varied. And so you've got different level experts, different access to different data sets, and very rarely do we see those crossover where they have access to understanding their holistic customer experience from the same lens.
Yeah. So speaking of the silos, we see silos just really inhibiting customer experience because there's one team that does the marketing, there's one team that does the email, there's one team that builds the website, or another one that builds the app. There's a
Yeah.
whole other team that does that data analysis.
Yeah.
So do you see the silos really inhibiting customer success in this area?
Yeah, and then we'll take that one level further, which is now these experiences exist on multiple marketplaces that you don't typically get to own in their entirety, right? You may cross over into other point of purchase experiences, or consumers are researching your brand and product or service in a multitude of places that you may or may not own. So not only are you trying to connect these siloed perspectives of the experience, just across brand and media and the site and digital and marketing, like all these different teams are coming together, but now you've got all these experiences that even those teams don't own or touch, exponentially increasing where your customers are finding you or exploring you. So yes is the short answer to that question. I think we see an enormously disconnected view of the customer experience once you try to unpack that and understand how to connect it across those channels.
Yeah, and what we're focusing on in our training is teaching our students in CX Studios University that we're focusing that it goes across all these different engagement points. It's not just, hey, what is that expectation when somebody comes to the site? Finding out that user experience when someone comes to the site. It's also, what's that expectation when someone sees the bus wrap around,
Mhm.
the bus wrap and clicks the QR code, and then they come in to your app. And then maybe they don't go from your app. Maybe they don't want to watch your video on the app. Maybe they want to go to your website, or maybe they're going to be in your waiting room, right? What's the stuff in the waiting room on the screens? Like, how does that affect the visit with
Yeah.
the healthcare provider? All those different things are different touch points, and different silos own those, and nobody talks to each other. So how do you cross that user experience and make it right, make it be successful? And what's that testing look like? How do we test those screens in the doctor's office, or those screens at the deli counter, or in the store against how does that go across the whole experience? I mean, there's so many silos that just, that nobody's thinking about connecting
Yeah.
and testing, and
Yeah.
how do they affect that end?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So I think that's a great segue into. I'm happy to share a little bit of content around, how do we really think about that, what we call the insights landscape. So, for example, as we consider that, there are all of these different cross points and channels in that experience that you just described, Lee. And I think the more data we get access to, the harder it is to understand, and the harder it feels, and the more overwhelming it feels. And so, what teams do is they tend to throw up their hands and they say, either I'm going to exist on one singular end of the spectrum or another, but trying to find something in the middle is too difficult. And certainly trying to find something that answers both quant and qual and can cross those channels from a tool set that's accessible to all of their teams, whether they're expert level users or not, is really difficult. And so as we think about that spectrum, as I like to think of it, as insights and accuracy, within that you've got sort of this bottom left quadrant, which is where nobody wants to exist. This is where, if you're just making gut-based decisions and you're not being data driven, you're not being insight led, you're not taking into account that customer feedback, you exist in a world of nothing but bias. So
I
certainly nobody wants to live here.
I like to call that the hippo. And I have to give Avinash Kaushik kind of a props up for that term, the hippo, the highest paid person's opinion
Yep,
in the room. That's where I
exactly.
think intuition lives.
Exactly. Yep, exactly. This is where the hippos preside for sure. And so the alternatives to then being just, gut based is, you could be really high on user research. So more traditional UX research, you need a very broad and experienced UX research team typically to do this responsibly, because there are really critical things like bias and solid methodology and framework that you need to ensure exists to capture reliable UX research insights. And so this is highly valuable when you have that expert team But it's very labor intensive. It takes a lot of time to talk to a handful of people and then to synthesize through the insights you get from that to understand directionally even what were your key takeaways. And so the danger of that is it can become dangerously anecdotal, and you're making multi-million-dollar decisions based on the feedback of 6 people alone because that took you so much time and energy. The inverse of that is more quantitative. So if that's the qual, you've got the quant on the other end of the spectrum, and this is more retrospective. This is the world I come from, A/B testing and optimization. And really what exists here is highly accurate, right? To the 100th decimal, with statistical significance, which is going to be a better or worse experience, and to whatever power you want to look at that. And that's great, but there's a really high opportunity cost with running A/B tests or running multiple experiences through an experimentation engine over and over without certainty that you're pulling the right levers or the best levers, that you have validation and confirmation that they're real problems. And so while it's highly accurate here, and it's that inverse of the qual, it's very absent of the why. You don't understand the why of the consumer experience. So this is where we really focus on how do we make a more accessible solution that lets you understand a really high volume. So it's not just a half dozen people, but it's hundreds of people worth of qualitative feedback that's reliable. And then how do you also benchmark and organize and reliably make it easy to synthesize the insights from that, because you're standardizing the way in which you're uncovering those feedback points. And most importantly, across those channels, how do you do that in a way that doesn't require technical integration? And I think one of the biggest benefits of that is you don't need the live traffic. You don't need the tech integration on your own site. That's great. You don't have to get hung up going through red tape forever. Everybody's throwing a parade for that. But taking that one step further, you also can test and measure competitive experiences. And I think that's a huge void in today's consideration of those journeys, like I mentioned, and like you were describing. Imagine that you have a direct-to-consumer site that also crosses over into Amazon and Best Buy and all these other points of purchase. Or imagine that you have a major coffee chain experience that has a digital ordering menu, as well as an app, as well as a loyalty program, as well as a site experience. And so you have to be able to connect the dots across all those channels and test that holistically.
Yeah, and the advent of the Internet of Things, like our watches, I like my experience with my bank, because now my bank comes up on my watch while I'm running. Oh my gosh, what the heck happened? So those things, like how do you weave those into the conversation? And the pandemic itself, like this, I mean, we are so far further so fast than, like, if that pandemic hadn't happened, we wouldn't be where we are right now.
Yeah.
And I think that even comes into this testing. How do you, click to brick, how are those experiences? How do you test those experiences? And that's the really, the really more thinking and advanced thinking that you have to get into. And I think Wevo just kind of helps sort through all of that on there. And so have you seen, like, the pandemic has really changed a lot?
Yeah, I mean, customer expectations were already at a pinnacle point before the pandemic of expecting our digital experiences to be more personalized and tailored and everything there. But personalization, even as a concept, has changed so much. It used to be deliver the right headline to the right person when they land on your site. And if you were doing that, that was like exceptional. Now, to your point, I get frustrated if my iPhone doesn't pre-populate the 2-factor authentication code for me that came from the, banking app experience that I signed into. So, all of these multiple channels have to be one experience and a holistic consideration for that. And I think the biggest shift in that we've seen is, I think it was Nielsen Norman that recently released a statistic that the demand for this really illustrates the demand for insights at large brands and organizations being higher than ever. We are collectively going to need 100 million research professionals in the space by 2050, which, by the way, astonishingly is not that far away.
Yeah.
That is a huge number of how are we going to feed and fuel this demand for insights? And so I think paired with the ability for the super pros in UX research to be able to gather reliable qual, and the super pros in analytics to be able to gather and measure reliable quant, you have to have a tool set that's democratizable across an organization.
Yeah.
And democratizable with trust. You have to trust its methodology. You have to trust the framework and the way in which it gathers that data and then helps you understand that data. And those are big, hard things. And that's certainly what we strive to solve for. And then on the other side of that, where your team so critically fits in is, great, now what does that tell us? Like, what do we do with that? How do we make this better? How do we improve this and continue to optimize it? And that's really the long game.
Yeah, and what we're focusing on with our training is that we're cross training. It's not just somebody that is just that dedicated person to the UX testing. It's that they understand the concepts, and maybe you might have somebody that really likes to pick up in that, but they also understand this needs to be measured. So, and it needs to figure it out along the journey. So maybe it needs to be orchestrated. And how do we pop in some, testing on our email templates? We might need that. So understanding that the UX isn't just for, so I think so many people get into that silo of, we need to do that UX testing just on our website or just on our application, right? They don't take it that step further. And that's what we're trying to bring into the whole mix of things, that it goes further. It's end to end. It's not, it's about even my loyalty program. Like, how does my loyalty program, is it easy to use? Can I get my points quickly? Do I have to have these long receipts like you get at CV?
Yeah.
I've actually seen people make a costume out of the yeah. Like, so many people make fun of that, right?
The train of a wedding dress. Yeah.
So like, that's what we're working to try and do, because just having somebody understand how to use an A/B testing tool, if that's all they can do, they don't see outside and they don't understand the repercussions. So that's why what we're trying to do is so important, is to go into that testing. And I think the pandemic has a lot to do with that as well, because that frame of mind and that thinking has always been one person, one tool. Well, why can't it be one person across a lot of tools to understand, or a lot of concepts to understand how important a tool like Wevo can be to every stage of that customer journey?
Right. And having that ability to democratize access to insights in a really reliable and scalable way, making it rapid and repeatable, is critical to allow, your team and marketers and UX researchers, all of these different roles have to have that access to not just insights, but insights that they trust, that give them a lens of both the quant and the qual. And I think one of the big trends we're really seeing, and that's going to catch up with many organizations sooner than they'd like to believe, is the combination of quant and qual. They are inseparable now. And I think many orgs are still a little bit lagging on that. They don't yet understand. They've really sophisticated one or the other. They've really matured their program around one or the other, and they're just catching up with the one that's missing. And I think, thinking back to that insights and accuracy spectrum, you can't just have one or the other. You have to have practitioners who can gather, and understand really the insights across both. What is the qual telling you? What is the quant telling you? Because it's about the what and the why. And I think what we see over and over again, it blows my mind that the industry win rate for A/B testing is still around 25%. And that tells us how often our, going back to the idea of hippos, how often our intuition is wrong if we all placed a bet on that. But also how often we sit there and go, that test idea should have won. I don't understand why it didn't. That's a lot of time and energy spent to go on a sure thing or a bet like that. And, the counter protective mechanism for that is to say, well, let's go do some really solid quant and qual problem discovery and really ensure that we're building a prioritized roadmap based around what we can validate as a real problem for our users. And then we can start to validate some solutions and build a really prioritized and thoughtful roadmap that's built on a more solid foundation.
So kind of going to that, how have you seen the artificial intelligence and machine learning really affect this particular part of the industry, you know, like from UX testing's perspective, AB experience, serving up the right experiences. How do you see, how is that affected? Is it positive, negative, you know, overwhelming?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's for the most part positive to skewed very fearful. I think it was some stat recently that I heard from Pew Research, I want to say, that was 72% of Americans are worried about a future in which robots and computers are going to replace their purpose.
Mhm.
And that's a valid concern, but I think what we've understood time and time again is it's part art and part science. And we can do a lot of heavy lifting with AI and make our processes and our reliability and our standardization and things like that much more scalable and much quicker and more accessible to do over and over again. But we still need humans to provide the strategy and to design the test idea and to study and know the UX research that needs to factor into designing it well, and then alternatively to say here's how we're going to thoughtfully choose which pages in which order we want to test to understand what objective, right? And so there's still we call it human augmented AI. There's always going to be a balance of that, and I think our CEO at Wevo said it best. He said, "Synergy, not separation, is going to be the key to success. These things cannot be separated, but when they work together, it's a heck of a lot more powerful than when we resist one versus the other."
Yeah, and it just gives more trust into it because you still have that human eye and the empathy. You know, like you need, and that's a cornerstone of customer experience, is that empathy. And if you don't go in with that empathy, there's no way, like the testing's just cold. You know, you can't put context to it, and empathy helps to do that, especially in customer experience. So like going from that understanding, that empathy, there's not a lot of people out there that have that understand that in the CX, in the CX world. A lot of people think it's just this one tool, right? And I know how to use this tool, but there's a customer out there that, why are they rage clicking? You got to understand, why are they rage clicking? Because
Right.
it doesn't work. And finding that talent is just, it's really tough. That's why there's a war out there right now. Like it's one of the biggest things that CTOs and CIOs and even CMOs are looking at right now, that there's not that talent out there. And it's tough for companies right now to change that mindset. The typical agency out there is very focused on a project or implementing a tool, and they have a person to do that. But they don't look beyond that. The customer themselves needs people who understand across the board that whole CX piece, and especially into the UX. Going back to your factor before about needing that 100 million research professionals. Like, where are we going to find that talent? That's just not going to be there. And so how do you build teams across? And that's what we're focused on, like building these multi-talented, multi-solutionists that understand across the board to help rectify some of this, this loss, that this talent war. Because the agencies themselves, as I was starting to say, the agencies themselves, for them to make this change, to be able to create multi-solutionists, they have to take people off the bench and they have to train. And that's hours upon hours upon hours. And what we're investing is, we're making the bet that we can train people to understand, how do I leverage Wevo in the UX of not just I'm building a site, but how does it go across the journey? That's what we're betting on, is that this training is going to enable us to build a crew, a giant crew of multi-solutionists.
Absolutely.
So that's, when I get excited when I get to teach people about Wevo, and like, hey, you don't understand, like, it's not just the app, it's so much more.
Yeah.
With that.
And I think about it as you describe that. I visualized, and this is going to date me, but the old Trivial Pursuit pieces, that is probably all digital now and run by robots. I don't know, but the old Trivial Pursuit pieces, and you had to get all the different, 6 different colored slices of the
Yeah.
pie. Yeah. And I think that's very akin to what you're describing is when you can fill in a really foundational understanding of expertise and skill set of expertise across a really well-rounded understanding of the industry needs as a whole, that's a much more valuable team player that you can plug in and scale to accomplish so much more output. I think to your earlier point of analysis paralysis, people withhold progress for perfection way too often. And so that also applies to staffing and teams. I mean, the one of the biggest things that we hear about Wevo now is one of our biggest value propositions to our customers that we never would have predicted 3 or 4 years ago, which is I can't hire people fast enough to keep up with these insights that I need to understand about my experiences to improve them and optimize them on an ongoing basis. I can't find people to begin with, let alone the pace at which I know I need more of them. And so, we're really so well aligned to your vision of, and I just love it. I love the idea of like, if you have these brilliant utility players who can do all those, who can fill in all those parts of the Trivial Pursuit wheel, they are so much more enormously valuable to accomplish, a much greater scale of output and efficiency.
Yeah. And like so many times I've been called like, hey, you're a unicorn. Like recruiters will come after you because when you understand across the marketing stack, all these different tools, it really sets you apart because not many people will cross, especially if they're in their bubble of, hey, I know how to program for a content management system, or I know how to do, data analysis, right? But they don't step out, and that's a product of the agency world at this point. And that's one of the things we're betting on is that if we can get people that want to do a change in their career, or they're just out of school and they want to try something different, we look at people
Absolutely.
from all different types of backgrounds and help to bring them in and give them the foundations that they need in programming. But then we come in and we're doing a whole thing around UX, like we're focusing on UX tools so they can understand that. Again, I keep going back to it, but it's not just the website. So many people just have that focus and that silo of thinking of it's just that. And there's so much more you can do. And Wevo can, because it isn't just about a screen. It's about an image. It's about, different things. And when you can start to figure out, hey, my content, if you pair it with content affinity, then you start to get really a lot more powerful tools that you're working with.
And to your point, you have to look at these different lenses. It's not just the design and the UX and the messaging and the copy and the images. It's also the value proposition of the product or the service and the brand credibility, and all these different layers are part of the holistic experience. The site, the page, the journey across multiple touch points in that end-to-end experience. And so I think you're spot on, and creating a stable of really a well-diversified portfolio at the macro level of a bench that can go in a multitude of directions responsibly and really efficiently deep, versus just a limited number of people who can go in a limited number of directions really deeply. It's such a better vision for, you're creating a center of excellence of people, and then each of those people is their own center of excellence, which is a really cool vision. I can't wait to see it all come to huge fruition. It's going to be great.
I get my students graduated through here, so
Yeah.
it's going to be a lot of fun. What I want to also cover before we wrap up here is I want to understand some of the successes that you guys have had with some of your clients using Wevo.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think a lot of what we hear is, especially in the pandemic season, has been not only how do I understand and improve the insights about my own experience, but how do I take a broader view to looking at my competitive landscape more responsibly. And so one of the biggest requests that we've gotten over and over again is for brands or companies to look at their own experience compared to competitive experiences on a regular basis, and looking at not just how did my experience perform and what was the why, and what was the quant and what was the qual, but also how did that perform against industry benchmark, and how are the industry benchmarks changing, and how are my customers' experiences changing, and how are my competitors' experiences changing? And so I think one of the biggest demand areas that we've really seen grow is in that space of looking across a view of not just your own experience, but that competitive marketplace, which tells you so many different, we speaking of silos, like it's hard enough to do our own experiences, our own brands and products and services well, let alone to find the time and energy to go examine others. And I think that's one of the most popular things we've heard is you can just go test any of those additional experiences and not have to have access to their site or have their traffic or anything like that.
That's a very, very awesome aspect that I love about Wevo, that, hey, I want to understand why my competitor over there is doing so well. What's the appeal, and if I did something similar, would that work? And it's not just a hunch anymore. You have the data to back it up.
You can test it. Absolutely. And one of the taking that all the way down the field, we've had one customer came up with the request and then it's just taken off like wildfire, which is, can I just look at my competitors on a quarterly basis? And I don't have to think about it. You just go run those tests for me, come back and then share those insights. And now I'm able to keep a really close eye on that marketplace while I'm also keeping an intentionally close eye on my own experiences. So yeah, that's one of the big things. And then I think to your earlier point, just really stitching and connecting across journeys has been the other big growth area that we've heard just huge demand on. So going from app to, site or menu, digital menu in a drive-through, for example, or going from email loyalty, right? Going from a loyalty email to the landing page. That's one of the most disconnected experiences we see over and over again. And there's no incentive. It's completely devoid of, to your point on empathy, what real users care about. Well, we care about when we're shopping or engaging. So, yeah.
Well, I want to thank you, Jenni, for your time today. This is a great conversation. So thank you all for sticking out with us. If you've listened, we've had a great conversation. Thank you, Jenni Bruckman from Wevo, and I'm Li Evans from CX Studios. We will talk to you next time.
Thanks so much for having me, Li. It was great.
Yep.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of the CX to the N Factor podcast. If you enjoyed our video, please hit the like button and leave us a comment. We've got more great content coming out regularly, so be sure and subscribe to our channel so you'll be notified when we launch new episodes. In the meantime, you can dig into our blog at cxstudios.io or follow us on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. Until next time, keep putting the customer experience at the front of your strategy.